Laura was 37 weeks pregnant, just 2 weeks away from welcoming her first child. Although her husband was no longer by her side, the love she felt for the baby within her made everything feel warm and sweet. As a first-time mother, she cherished the sacredness of every moment spent preparing for her baby's arrival. Everything she did, no matter how small or tiring, held a wonderful happiness she had never experienced before. Today, she took out the baby's clothes to wash them. Each tiny shirt and sock was carefully cleaned and hung up to dry. These simple items carried a deep sense of appreciation. She felt her heart beat stronger, her steps around the house filled with joy. The feeling of her hands touching these small items stirred a love that was hard to put into words for this little one she had awaited for so long. Each passing day brought her closer to the joy of motherhood. Though her husband was no longer there, the happiness alone was enough to make her feel blessed. Each tiny sock, each small shirt, was like a promise of love, a sweet anticipation to welcome her child into this world. As she was washing clothes, a sudden dizziness hit her like a storm. She quickly grabbed onto the edge of the wash basin, hoping it would pass. But instead of relief, a sharp, intense pain shot through her abdomen, making her hold her breath. Instinctively, her hand went to her 8-month belly. Too early, this couldn't be happening. The baby wasn't ready to arrive yet, but the unmistakable contractions came strong and painful. Her legs trembled. Her vision blurred as she struggled to reach the phone on the kitchen counter. Each step was a challenge, her mind foggy, but she finally managed to call for a taxi. When the taxi finally arrived, the driver, a sturdy man in his 50s, noticed the worry on her face and quickly offered his assistance. "Please take me to the hospital as fast as you can," Laura panted, clutching her belly with labored breaths. The driver, equally alarmed, pressed down on the accelerator, and the car sped off down the empty road. For Laura, every second felt like an eternity. Waves of nausea and dizziness overwhelmed her, making each passing moment feel torturous. As the taxi raced down the deserted road, Laura suddenly sensed a vague unease. She glanced out the window and saw a group of unfamiliar people running across the street, their expressions anything but friendly. Suddenly, a black car appeared, swerving close to her taxi and beginning to follow closely. Laura felt her heart skip a beat, unable to comprehend what was happening. The people in the car weren't just trailing them, they were signaling for the taxi driver to pull over. "Watch out," Laura shouted, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Though the driver, too, sensed something was wrong, his 30 years of driving experience kept him calm under pressure. With quick reflexes, he expertly swerved, maneuvering the wheel skillfully to avoid the black car closing in from behind. In a split second, he spun the wheel to keep the taxi from being forced onto the shoulder, pressing hard on the gas to pick up speed. But the pursuers had no intention of backing down. A motorbike suddenly sped up alongside the left side of the taxi, forcing the driver to slam on the brakes to avoid a collision. Laura's hand gripped the seat tightly, her eyes filled with fear. She didn't know what they wanted, but it was clear these people weren't here to help. Thanks to his quick reflexes and the skills of an experienced driver, the taxi driver skillfully maneuvered the car to dodge the vehicles chasing them, narrowly avoiding a collision. "Stay calm," he said to Laura through labored breaths, trying to keep the car steady. The other vehicles eventually gave up as the taxi driver displayed his expertise, quickly turning into a side street. They lost the pursuers, who could no longer continue the chase. Although the danger had passed, Laura still felt exhausted as the pain began tormenting her again. Even so, she couldn't help but feel grateful to the driver, who had saved her from the perilous situation. "Thank you," Laura whispered, her voice weak but filled with gratitude. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, nodding, his eyes filled with determination. "Don't mention it. We'll get to the hospital safely, just hang in there." When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team immediately transferred her to a wheelchair. By this time, she could barely speak, her words slurred, and her vision increasingly blurred. "Don't worry, you'll be fine," a nurse reassured her, pushing the wheelchair toward the delivery room. Dr. Clark, a seasoned doctor with a calm demeanor, quickly assessed the situation. Laura's cervix hadn't dilated enough, and there was no time to wait. "We need to perform an emergency cesarean section immediately. Prepare the operating room," he ordered firmly. The nurses promptly prepared everything necessary, getting ready for the urgent procedure. Every task was carried out smoothly, but there was a subtle tension in the air. Following protocol, Dr. Clark stepped outside to scrub in before entering the operating room. Time ticked by and all the nurses and assisting doctors fell silent, their eyes fixed on the door, waiting. But Dr. Clark had yet to return. A nurse, her face filled with worry, decided to go look for him. She quickly ran out, but when she returned, her expression showed clear confusion. "I couldn't find him anywhere," she said, her voice trembling. The tension in the operating room grew heavier, and everyone began wondering what had happened to Dr. Clark. Then, suddenly, the door to the operating room swung open. A man dressed in surgical attire entered, his face completely obscured behind a thick mask, making it impossible for anyone to recognize him. He didn't say a word, only quietly approached the operating table, intensifying the anxious silence in the room. The man gestured toward his throat, indicating that he couldn't speak, possibly due to laryngitis. The assistant surgeon, though a bit perplexed, immediately understood, assuming it was Dr. Clark returning to continue the operation. Everyone in the room watched him closely, awaiting his instructions, but instead of resuming the procedure himself, he signaled to the assistant surgeon to proceed. "What do you want me to do?" the assistant surgeon asked, looking surprised. The masked man simply nodded silently, giving no further instructions. Despite the unusual situation, it wasn't unheard of for the lead surgeon to entrust an assistant with the steps of a procedure in cases like this. Meanwhile, Laura, though semi-conscious, opened her eyes and saw the masked man enter. Although her vision was blurry, something about him seemed oddly familiar, and an invisible wave of fear quickly filled her heart. She tried to scream, but only a weak sound escaped her throat. Her trembling hand pointed toward the man as if to warn those around her. The nurses rushed to her side, thinking she was experiencing a panic attack. "Don't worry, you're safe," a nurse gently whispered, patting her arm to reassure her. But the masked doctor signaled to the anesthesiologist, his face showing no emotion, as if he had some plan no one else knew about. "Do you want to administer general anesthesia?" the anesthesiologist asked, his voice hesitant. The masked doctor nodded. Though this wasn't the standard procedure, the anesthesiologist followed the instructions without objection. Laura gradually slipped into a deep sleep, while the surgery continued under the supervision of the mysterious doctor. The baby was finally born, and its cries echoed through the room, signaling life. A wave of relief spread throughout the air, and some of the nurses couldn't contain their emotions, gently clapping in celebration. The assistant doctor, with a proud expression, handed the scissors to the silent doctor, hoping he would cut the umbilical cord. However, he seemed hesitant and uncertain. After a long pause, he finally cut the cord, but something in the atmosphere made everyone uneasy. When the doctor picked up the baby, its cries suddenly stopped. The operating room, which had been filled with noise and hurried movement, now fell into an eerie silence. The baby, now quiet, stared up at the doctor wearing the thick mask, not in fear but with a look full of suspicion. The doctor held the baby up, and for a moment it felt as if the baby and the doctor were staring at each other. Then, suddenly, the baby's weak voice rang out, so faint that only the doctor could hear it clearly: 3 words: "Murderer." It wasn't the babbling of a newborn, but a complete sentence. A chill ran down the doctor's spine, as if he had just witnessed something beyond his understanding. Breaking the silence, the masked doctor exclaimed, "Did anyone hear that?" His eyes widened in shock as he looked around at the others. The nurses and surgical team exchanged confused glances, none of them understanding what he was talking about. "Did anyone hear the baby just speak?" he repeated, his voice trembling, but all anyone could do was stare at him in silence, unsure how to react. The doctor became increasingly agitated, grasping his head with both hands, clearly trying to make sense of what he had just heard. No one else had heard the voice from the baby. "Get the baby off me," the doctor suddenly shouted, his voice filled with panic, shattering the stillness in the room. His once steady hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Suddenly he released the baby, allowing it to gently rest on the mother's chest, who was still unconscious from the anesthesia. The entire team stood frozen, unable to react. No one understood what had just happened. Without saying another word, the doctor turned and rushed out of the operating room, running and yelling, his footsteps and screams echoing through the corridor. Everyone stood there, stunned, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. The nurses quickly checked the baby, who had begun crying again as soon as it was placed on the mother's chest. No one could understand the sudden departure of the doctor or the strange scene that had just unfolded. One nurse, still trembling, spoke up. Something was wrong with the doctor the moment he came back into the room. He was acting strange. I think he believed the baby was speaking to him. The others looked at each other, unable to believe it. It sounded absurd. Newborns, especially freshly born ones, cannot talk. Neurologically and physiologically, it is impossible. A newborn's brain is not developed enough to process language, and although their vocal cords are capable of crying, they cannot form words. Suddenly, the tranquility in the operating room was shattered by an unexpected change. Laura, still lying motionless on the operating table, suddenly began showing suspicious signs. The nurses looked at each other in panic as they noticed her heartbeat gradually weakening, then stopping altogether. The silence in the room grew heavy, a sense of tension enveloping everyone. Her heart rate is dropping. She's unresponsive, one of the nurses exclaimed, her voice trembling as she quickly checked the machine. The assisting doctor, his face twisted with concern, rushed over and began performing emergency procedures. Despite their efforts, Laura's heart still did not respond, and her condition worsened by the minute. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, but the situation only seemed to worsen. After a while, the assisting doctor looked up, his gaze filled with worry and helplessness. She's gone into cardiac arrest. This is a sign of clinical death. His cold words were like a knife to the hearts of everyone in the room. They all stopped, unable to believe what they had just heard. A deathly silence fell over the room, with only the sounds of the machine slowly shutting down. No one spoke a word, but in each person's heart, a shared thought began to form. What will happen to the baby, who has just entered this world only to face such immense loss? Its mother, who had carried this precious life for so many months, was now gone. And the father, who should have been the protector, the one to shield the child throughout its life, had passed away before even being able to meet his newborn. The death of the mother, the absence of the father, could the baby ever find light in this world? The coldness of loneliness seemed to envelop every thought in the room, and within each heart, a deep sorrow for the helpless child seemed impossible to erase. It was just a tiny being, still unable to understand the world, yet burdened with such great pain. The people in the room silently exchanged glances, their eyes filled with compassion, sorrow, and a fragile hope that life might offer a bright path for this child. In the quiet space, everyone present shared a silent grief, each person feeling the loss that words could not express. They couldn't help but feel sorrow for her, a woman who had endured too much tragedy. She had just lost her husband, and now she faced death herself. Never before had suffering weighed so heavily on a woman. A few months ago, when Luis, Laura's husband, was taken in a terrible car accident, her life suddenly plunged into darkness. She vividly remembered the moment she received the call from Richard, her husband's assistant. Richard said that he and Luis had been traveling together for work, and during the accident he had been sitting in the driver's seat and was fortunate to escape unscathed. However, Louis had been sitting in the back seat and was not as fortunate. The car lost control, and just as Richard realized the situation, the car exploded. Louis had no chance of survival. At this moment, Laura recalled a terrifying event, something that had happened with Richard, which she had never shared with anyone. Once she went to her husband's office when Louis was not there, and Richard, without anyone's supervision, approached her in a very unusual way. She remembered him standing too close, his eyes containing something unsettling. Then, suddenly he made moves that made her uncomfortable, as if he was intentionally crossing boundaries and trying to touch her. That feeling truly terrified her. She hurriedly left the office and decided to keep her distance from Richard ever since, no matter the reason. But now, recalling everything, Richard's presence still lingered like a ghost, not only because of the pain of Louis's death but also the sense of unease about the danger he posed. She couldn't forget that moment, and even though he was the one who had informed her about her husband's death, she couldn't erase the unease she felt about him. At the funeral, while Laura was crying alone, Richard approached, his gaze dark. "You're free now," he whispered, his mouth curling into a sinister smile. "I still love you." Without thinking, Laura slapped him hard across the face. "I will never belong to you." The most important person in my life now is my son. Richard's face darkened, and in anger he replied, "The only child you have will be mine." A chill ran down Laura's spine. If Richard wanted to harm her husband to claim her, was he now planning something with the baby? Fear overwhelmed her mind. Sensing danger, Laura decided to leave. She rented a small house in a remote area, hoping to find safety in the final months of her pregnancy. With the savings from her husband and the insurance, she could live peacefully, away from Richard and the dangers lurking. The beeping of the heart monitor sounded steadily in the chaotic room. "Doctor, look at the screen." A nurse shouted, her face full of worry. The screen showed a faint but clear heartbeat. Laura was still breathing, although weakly. It was truly a miracle. "Hurry, inject 1 milligram of epinephrine," the doctor urgently ordered. Laura's vital signs slowly began to stabilize. The entire medical team looked at each other, unable to believe what was happening before their eyes. Cheers erupted as the room filled with joyful tears while everyone embraced, astonished by the miraculous recovery. Laura gradually regained consciousness, opening her eyes to look at her newborn. With trembling hands, she pulled her baby into her arms, kissed the baby's cheek, and began breastfeeding. The scene moved everyone in the room to tears, unable to hold back their emotions. But that joy was quickly extinguished when Laura's eyes widened in panic, and a horrifying scream escaped her mouth as she suddenly remembered something. Richard. The entire room fell silent, all eyes turning to Laura, confused and unsure of what was happening. An attending doctor slowly approached, trying to calm her. "Laura, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She was still frantic, screaming, her voice trembling. "Richard." He asked to stop. "He's dangerous," she tried to explain, stammering in fear. "That man is not a doctor, he's Richard, my husband's former assistant. I'm sure he wants to harm my baby," she screamed in desperation. The medical staff exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what to believe. Laura continued to explain her suspicions about Richard, claiming that she believed he was involved in her husband's death, and now he wanted to harm her unborn child. Just as she finished speaking, the operating room door swung open, and Dr. Clark stepped in, his face bruised with a noticeable wound on his forehead. To everyone's shock, he was only wearing his underwear and a hospital gown, his body covered in injuries. "Doctor, what happened to you?" a nurse asked in panic, rushing toward him. Panting, Dr. Clark explained, "I was about to return to the operating room when a man in a hoodie approached. He said there was an emergency, someone had fainted on the stairs. He begged me to follow him, and I did, but when I got there, there was no one. Then I was struck on the head." The room went silent in shock as everyone listened to Dr. Clark's words, unable to believe what he had just said. He continued, his voice trembling, "I was still somewhat conscious, but I saw him strip off my jacket and put it on. Then he pulled the mask up, and I saw his face before being tied up and locked in the basement. I had to free myself and run here." "Did he threaten you?" the attending doctor asked, his face pale. "He said he would kill me if I didn't tell him how to stop the heart of a newborn." Dr. Clark shuddered as he recalled. "At first I refused, but he beat me so brutally that I had no choice. I lied to him, telling him that glucose could do that, just sugar. But he believed it was poison." The nurses and doctors exchanged looks, recognizing the issue. They immediately notified hospital security. One of the security guards, after hearing Laura's description, paused for a moment before saying if he exposed his face, the security cameras might have captured it. The group hurried to the security room, hoping to find information about Richard. Laura sat in the wheelchair, her baby in her lap. With Dr. Clark's help, they found the moment in the video when the man pulled his hood down and revealed his face. As they rewatched the footage, Laura screamed in panic, "It's him! Richard!" She shook uncontrollably. On the screen, they saw the imposter tie up Dr. Clark and then find the glucose solution in the medical room. The security immediately called the police. Shortly after, an announcement came over the radio. "We have detected a man wearing a doctor's coat walking down Main Avenue. He appears suspicious." Everyone thought the matter was settled. But no, it seemed there was an accomplice, and Richard had successfully escaped. He had fled, and the danger seemed to grow even more terrifying for Laura and her child. A few days after being discharged from the hospital, she returned to the empty house, where only the two of them cared for each other. However, her young child was a great source of encouragement, making Laura stronger than ever before. With each passing day, The presence of her child gave her more strength, reminding her that her baby was the only reason she could face all challenges with resilience. One night, when her son had fallen asleep, Laura lay in the bedroom, unable to sleep because her worried thoughts kept swirling around. Suddenly, she felt a strange presence in the room. When she opened her eyes, she could not believe what she saw, a familiar figure standing in the corner of the room. It was Richard. He had returned, standing there in the darkness, his cold and hateful gaze fixated on her. Fear surged within Laura, and she felt the danger drawing closer. In that brief moment, she thought death was near. "Richard, what are you doing here?" Laura trembled, her hands clutching her child tightly, trying to remain calm amid the panic. Richard stepped closer, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "I'm here to finish what was left undone," he said, his voice cold and sharp like a knife. "You think you can escape from me, Laura?" Laura felt her body freeze, but she knew she couldn't let him harm her child. "Don't come near my baby," she screamed, glaring at him. At that moment, a loud noise came from the door. A police officer rushed in, saw the situation, and immediately took action. "Stop right there," he shouted, pulling a wooden baton from his belt and striking Richard's hand hard, causing him to fall to the ground. "No way." Richard snarled, trying to get up but was quickly subdued by the officer. "You won't get away, Laura." He struggled but couldn't do anything as the baton struck his leg, making it impossible for him to stand. The officer turned back to Laura and gently asked, "Are you okay? Where's the baby?" Laura trembled but nodded. "My baby, he's fine. Thank you." In her panic, Laura embraced the officer, both grateful and terrified. She gasped for air, feeling a sense of safety slowly return as the officer gently placed a hand on her shoulder, reassuring her, "You're safe now. I'm here." Laura clung to the officer and her child, feeling safer than ever. The police officer smiled faintly. "We've been tracking him, and fortunately we arrived just in time. You don't need to worry anymore. He's been arrested and can no longer harm you or your child." Laura felt the strength of a man she hadn't felt in a long time, not since her husband passed away. This unfamiliar sense of safety enveloped her, making all her worries seem to fade away. Now that the danger was over, she felt relieved, as though a heavy burden had been lifted. Richard was handcuffed and led away, while Laura sat down on the bed, sighing in relief. She looked at her child in her arms, the fear and worry slowly dissipating. She knew that, although many challenges lay ahead, she would always be strong and protect her child at all costs. As the days passed, Laura and the police officer grew closer. Care and affection gradually blossomed between them, and after some time, they decided to be together. Love guided them to marriage, and they built a happy little family. Laura had a child from her previous relationship, but now they also had a beautiful baby girl together. The family lived in a space full of love and peace, leaving behind the pains of the past. The story of Laura concludes by delivering a message about inner strength and human resilience in difficult circumstances. It affirms that, despite facing danger and evil individuals, love and family protection can help us overcome anything. At the same time, it serves as a reminder of the devastating consequences of malicious actions, encouraging alertness and courage in all situations. You might be wondering about this story, whether it's true or just fiction, right? Your question is very reasonable because a newborn baby cannot speak. That's true, a newborn can't utter such words, as the development of a human being has been determined by nature for thousands of years. However, in this story, because Richard is an evil and ruthless person, he always seeks ways to harm others. Especially since he tried to harm Laura and her child 3 times. Hearing the words "killer" was the result of his mind being too frantic and filled with malicious intentions. Those words did not come from the baby but were simply imagined by Richard, as he had become so obsessed with his sinful actions. The baby didn't say anything, and in fact no one heard it except Richard. Finally, if you enjoyed this story, please encourage me by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. See you in the next stories, and may God bless you.